Welcome, everyone, to the second public science panel brought to you by the University of Washington's astrobiology program. Thanks for joining us live on YouTube, where you can find and follow UW Astrobiology's channel, which is full of lectures and videos all about astrobiology, including last month's public science panel on the best place to look for life in the universe. My name is Mike Wong, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the UW Astrobiology program. And tonight I'm joined by four of my fellow scientists who are all driven by their curiosity about the possibility of life in the universe. Tonight, we are delving into one of the greatest unsolved scientific mysteries of our time, the emergence of life. While people have speculated about this question for ages, in the past few years and decades, scientific inquiry has made great progress towards understanding our origins. Our four panelists take four different approaches to unraveling this multidisciplinary scientific problem, and they will share their insights in a moderated discussion, which will last about 40 minutes, and then answer your questions in the final 20 minutes of tonight's event. And you can type those questions into the chat on YouTube. I'll also advise you to pay close attention to what the panelists say tonight, because there will be a fun and friendly competition where you can showcase what you've learned tonight, and I'll reveal a bit more about that later on. But without further ado, let's begin by getting to know our panelists. So panelists, I'd like you to please say a few words about who you are, what you study, and what your favorite kind of soup is, besides the primordial kind, of course. So let's begin with Dr. Zoe Todd.
Hi, everyone. As Mike said, thanks for the introduction, Mike. I'm Zoe Todd. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University of Washington as a Sagan Fellow. I work on origins of life, so trying to understand prebiotic chemistry, how life emerged on Earth, and what this might mean for the possibility of life in other places in our universe. My favorite kind of soup is most definitely the primordial soup, but second favorite soup would be, I don't know, broccoli cheddar.
Excellent choice. Let's go next with Nick Wogan.
Hello, yeah, I'm Nick, and I'm a fourth-year PhD student at University of Washington, and I mainly use computer models to try to better understand the chemistry of Earth's atmosphere 4 billion years ago, around the time life began. And yeah, my favorite soup has got to be tomato soup, but as long as there's a grilled cheese involved too.
Excellent. Zach, why don't you go next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Zach Cohen. I'm a grad student in the chemistry department at UW, and I study membranes. So think the outer compartment of your cells, but the membranes I study are different because they're composed of more primitive molecules that could have been available on the early Earth for the origin of life. And my favorite soup is ramen.
Is that a soup? I guess it is. Okay, cool. Yeah.
I'm counting it.
Yeah. And last but not least, our special alum guest, Rika Anderson.
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor of biology at Carleton College, and I study the genomes of microbes and viruses to try to understand how they evolve over time. So I look at the genomes of microbes and viruses in deep sea hydrothermal vents, which is where life may have begun, maybe not. We'll probably talk about that later. And I also try to think about how microbes may have evolved deep in Earth history 4 billion years ago. And my favorite soup, it's kind of a toss-up, either between any soup my husband makes, because he's quite the soup chef, or my mother's soto ayam, which is an Indonesian chicken soup.
Yum, that sounds good. So tonight we're here to discuss our origin story and the potential for other such origin stories elsewhere in the universe. And so origin of life theories seek to describe this transition between a non-living state and a living state. And that means that they naturally exist in a mental framework that makes a formal distinction between things that are alive and things that aren't. So a logical place to begin our discussion tonight would be the definition of life. NASA's working definition of life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. And I'll repeat that because it's a bit of a mouthful. It's a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. Panelists, what do you make of this definition? Is it spot on, or could it use a little tweaking?
Well, I can start. I don't want to dominate here as the alum here, but I ask this question of my students every time I teach a class on the origin and early evolution of life. And the way this conversation usually goes is they give me their 5 characteristics of what life is. So it can move, it uses energy, it can reproduce, it can evolve. Those are usually some of the characteristics that come up. And then we talk about it some more, and we talk about the NASA definition that you just gave. And then we talk some more about whether we even need a definition of life. And we end up going around and around in circles. And usually by the end of the conversation, my students have decided there is no definition to life. There's no meaning of life. And it can be kind of nihilistic, which is both hilarious, but also sort of predictable. So I kind of love that conversation. And I think I'm going to leave it at that and let my other panelists weigh in on that a little bit.
All right. Do we have a panel of nihilists, or are there some definitions out there?
I feel like I've had similar experiences. So yeah, I think the NASA definition is just fine. I think it's important to have a definition. So when all of us are talking about, or using the word life, we know what we're referring to. We just have a common definition of that word. But, just because we have a particular definition for that word doesn't have any fundamental meaning in my view. So just because we have a word for something in the English language doesn't mean it has to refer to something definite in the real world, right? Yeah.
That's a really interesting perspective.
I'll jump in. I also like this definition, and maybe in the future we'll have a much better definition. But for now, for me, the most important feature of life, I think, is Darwinian evolution. And that implies, that sounds kind of simple. I think it implies a couple of things. There has to be reproduction, so parent generating offspring. There has to be inheritance, so the offspring has to be related to the parent, and selection as well. So differences between the offspring resulting in different abilities to survive. All of that kind of wrapped up in Darwinian evolution. But yeah, in my mind, that's the important feature.
So I think as far as definitions of life go, this does pretty much as good as it can. But I agree that perhaps there is some tweaking, or when we find that first instance of life that is not on our planet, maybe it doesn't quite fit this definition, so maybe it needs to be adjusted. And I think an interesting thing I've also heard is that there's kind of not a complete transition from non-living to fully alive, like 0 to 100%, but maybe rather a gradient of something that is kind of alive, but kind of not. So I think having that subtlety in there is something that I'll be interested to see how that plays out in the future.
I think we also need to be careful in defining the difference between a living thing versus life itself, right? Because I would argue that any individual living thing cannot by itself evolve and is not by itself self-sustaining. There's no life form on this planet that is by itself self-sustaining. So there is a difference between is something alive and what is life itself. And I think what we're talking about here is the property of life, like the entire biosphere, and we have to be careful that we're making that distinction.
That's a great distinction. So you would say that NASA's definition is more describing something that is alive rather than life itself.
Other way around.
The other way around. NASA's definition describes life itself as self-sustaining, but not something that is alive that needs other things to be self-sustaining. Understood. Excellent. Yes, I love that distinction. So Rika, I know that you have thoughts on, whether or not a definition of life is even needed for astrobiological inquiry. Could you please share those with us?
Well, I mean, it's funny because every time I have this discussion with my students, we come around to this question of why are we having this debate in the first place? Do we need to have a clear definition in order to study the origin of life? And I know that among some in the astrobiology community, it's thought that perhaps we don't really need a definition of life. It's kind of like, as has been said in some Supreme Court cases, you know it when you see it, right? And that those of us who are biologists, we know what we're talking about. Others have said, no, we actually do need to have a definition of life for clear communication. But then the question is communication with whom, right? And to me, I think that the point at which the definition of life will become important is if we find, say, a mineral on Mars that seems to be making copies of itself in some strange way. Maybe it's self-sustaining. Maybe it's evolving in some way that looks like natural selection. At that point, people are going to be asking, have we found life or haven't we? And at that point, I think we might perhaps start needing to have a more serious conversation about what the definition of life is. For those of us who work in the field, maybe we don't, but I don't know if others have thoughts on that.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that, the updating of the definition? Well, if not, this has been a very fascinating beginning to our panel. I personally find that definitions tell me more about the definers rather than the definees. In other words, life is life, as we've been speaking about. It is what it is. It's out there. And the various definitions that scientists come up with tell me what those scientists think are important or crucial to life, and hence to life's beginning. So now I want to ask you, when you close your eyes and imagine the origin of life in your minds, what do you see?
Well, for me, even imagining a lifeless Earth, I still imagine it as a very chemically active place. So we know that there could have been, we think that there could have been biomolecules on the Earth. And one way that we know that is that the components, the building blocks of proteins, RNA, membranes, all of those things can be delivered to Earth by meteorites. And so quite possibly synthesized on the early Earth as well.
The first thing I think of is what the Earth looked like in the first place, right? I think that's really important context. And so the Hadean Earth, or the Earth as it looked 4.3 billion years ago, looked really different from how the Earth looks now, as Zach sort of indicated. So we would have had many more meteorite impacts hitting the surface of the planet. It probably would have had a methane-like haze, potentially. There would have been way more deep sea hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean because the planet will have just recently formed. So there was more heat left over in the crust and the core of the planet to create these hydrothermal vents. The moon was way closer back then. We're actually slowly losing our moon as it moves away from the planet. So the tides would have been much bigger. And the Earth was spinning faster around its axis. So day and night cycles would have only lasted 12 hours instead of 24. So I think that's one of the most important things to think of first as we're sort of visualizing where the origin of life could have happened.
Excellent. Thank you, Zach and Rika, for setting the stage and changing our perspective of where life would have originated. Well, it originated most likely here on Earth, but a very different Earth. And then Nick, I believe you're about to take it one step further.
Oh, I was just going to say that my background is an artist rendition of what maybe the Earth looked like 4 billion years ago. And the key thing to notice is that there's craters everywhere. And so right there was the asteroid impact 65 million years ago that destroyed the dinosaurs. And that impactor was something like 10, 20 kilometers in diameter. So very big. But those would have been happening all of the time on the Earth back then, like hundreds to thousands of those over fairly short periods of time. So it would have been a very different Earth for sure.
And if I can jump in then and say, I think it's kind of the interesting point of taking together the chemistry that Zach previously mentioned and all these environmental factors that Rika and Nick mentioned, and seeing how those are going to interact and potentially lead to the emergence of biomolecules and eventually life out of that. So that's kind of putting the origin of life in the planetary context, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, I feel like we've been talking a lot about planetary context, which is absolutely critical to the question of the origin of life. But what about life itself? How would you imagine, Darwinian evolution emerging out of this crazy different world? How would you imagine cellular forms coming about? Things like that.
So I feel like
I think.
Oh, sorry.
You go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. So I think this is one of the more contentious questions in Origin of Life, where there are definitely different camps of people who have very strong opinions. So in the interest of not being super partial to one or the other, if you can think about like a system that would need to contain some sort of genetic information so that it can propagate itself and contain that information as it goes along, you would need, as you said, encapsulation into some sort of cellular membrane or some sort of encapsulation like that, to be able to get this Darwinian evolution going on. So then the question is, how do you make these things from simple biomolecules and monomers that come together? So hopefully that wasn't too partial, but feel free to go into the camp side of things, everyone else.
Yeah, so I totally agree that like this is very like debated and uncertain, right? Because people imagine many different ways that life could have began. And so I can too, right? I can imagine. But I'll just describe one of them in a very biased way, but with the understanding that I am totally open to many different ideas. So I imagine a pond on the surface of the Earth, and I think of organic molecules being in that pond and reacting to make smaller organic molecules. And I imagine them reacting to make the first replicator. So the first sort of complicated molecule that could replicate itself. And then it could be, a fairly simple molecule, but once you have this replicator that can sort of replicate itself, but maybe imperfectly, every once in a while it makes a mistake during replication. That replication process is basically the first evolution. And so if you have this first replicator that undergoes evolution, it could increase in complexity slowly and ultimately, become a cell, and then the rest is history. So that's one way I imagine it.
That's how I think about it too, because you're right. That's the beginning of evolution right there. All evolution comes down to is some entity that's really good at making copies of itself in some way, right? And so in the earliest stages of the evolution of life, one theory is that the first replicators or the first replicating molecules would have been made of RNA. So our information is contained in DNA. That DNA gets turned into RNA, which maybe people in the audience have heard of because the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are made of RNA. And then that RNA gets turned into protein. And it's thought that RNA, which has this ability to both encode information, but also fold up and do cool things and perform functions and catalyze reactions, it's thought that RNA, by some, not everyone agrees, some people think that RNA may have been the first molecules to make copies of each other and get better and better at making copies of each other. And then the cool part is maybe some RNA molecules got really good at cooperating together to make copies of each other. And in that way, life could have become a little more complex over time.
So Nick, you mentioned a warm little pond at the surface of the planet is a good place for this RNA synthesis that Rika's been describing. It doesn't have to be you, Nick, or you, Rika, but panel, why is this a good location for the origin of life? Why is a pond a good place? And maybe if you want to be bold, throw out a few reasons why it might not be a good place.
I can throw out a couple of reasons why it is a good place. And I guess also some why maybe it isn't as well. But one thing about a shallow pond is that it, at least in theory, could evaporate and flood and evaporate and go through these cycles of wetting and drying. And that has been shown in experiments to help you convert, say, the building blocks of proteins, amino acids, into longer chains, into peptides. Is one good reason why those are attractive environments to think about the origin of life. Drying helps build biomolecules.
So these cycles of wetness and dryness, allowing the chemistry to take place. Very cool. So anyone else want to? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Also from a somewhat biased point of view, because I've worked on some of this stuff in the past, is some people think that UV light is very important as a source of energy to synthesize the building blocks of life or to start that prebiotic chemistry. And you're not going to have access to UV light deep in the ocean. If you go past a certain depth of water, most of that light is going to be cut off. So if you want that light to do reactions and to provide energy, you need to be towards the surface of the planet in a warm little pond.
That makes sense. Now, I know a competing hypothesis for the origin of life is one that takes place at deep sea hydrothermal vents, where UV light most definitely doesn't penetrate to. Rika, I know you study organisms that live in modern day vents. Could you share with us some insights from why vents might have been a good place for the origin of life?
There's a couple of thoughts there. One of them is that we know that there are certain chemical reactions that happen deep inside the bellies of vents that can create some of these organic molecules that we were talking about. And some of those organic molecules could have been potential precursors to like RNA, for example, or proteins, or lipid membranes, for example. The other thing that I like about deep sea hydrothermal vents is that they're almost like natural laboratories sitting at the bottom of the ocean, almost like well, for scientists out there, it's like having a PCR machine at the bottom of the ocean, because you can have, in one spot of a hydrothermal vent, you can have water that's up to 400 degrees Celsius, no oxygen whatsoever, full of all these reducing molecules. So a very certain type of chemistry, basically. And then 2 feet away, the water can be 2 degrees Celsius, so much colder, and a very different chemical composition. And then you have everything in between those two regions. And so having that mixture of different types of environments could potentially be very handy. Others have also suggested that in hydrothermal vents, you could have the right setup to create what's called a proton gradient. So creating gradients of electrons across different membranes, which is the basis of all modern metabolism. And so that could have been one way to get that started. I will say though that, some hydrothermal vents aren't that deep. There are some hydrothermal vents that are actually fairly shallow, that are near light. And so you could get UV light there. And I also should point out that, as I said, the early Earth was weird. It was spinning fast, those tides were pumping. And so it actually wouldn't have been as difficult to get things circulating. And so I don't actually think that we need to rely on a single environment for a setting for an origin of life. I think we can use the whole Earth. And I think that we actually limit ourselves by looking too much at only one location.
It's a fantastic point. Yeah. Well, let's now turn to how your own research sheds light on this massive problem of the origin of life. And we'll begin with Nick. Nick, you said you use computer models that simulate the physics and the chemistry of Earth's early atmosphere. What can we learn from those computer models about the origin of life?
So yeah, so with atmospheric models, we can roughly work out what sort of molecules would have been available for the origin of life. So just to take one example, lots of chemistry experiments, of origin of life chemistry experiments, they use a molecule called hydrogen cyanide. And they think that as origin of life, in their origin of life experiments, and they think hydrogen cyanide is maybe pretty important. And it turns out that hydrogen cyanide is actually made in the atmosphere between reactions of ultraviolet light and various molecules in the atmosphere. So what we can do with our models is roughly estimate or calculate how much hydrogen cyanide would have been produced in the atmosphere 4 billion years ago, around the time life began. And then with those calculations, we can work out roughly the concentrations of hydrogen cyanide in little ponds on the surface of the planet. And so the idea is that if we have these ranges of possible hydrogen cyanide concentrations, then in origin of life chemistry experiments, people can use reasonable hydrogen cyanide concentrations in their experiments that are representative of the Earth a long time ago. And the hydrogen cyanide is just one example. Like, you can use models to understand something about the temperature of the Earth a long time ago, or maybe how much ultraviolet light was shining on the surface, which is also a really important, well, potentially an important component of the origin of life. So that's the general idea. We can use models to roughly map out what the Earth was like back then.
Awesome. And so Zoe, you study how natural environments can take prebiotic molecules like the hydrogen cyanide that Nick was calculating, and then turn them into the building blocks of our genetic code. How exactly is this done, and what have you learned?
Yeah, so basically I just, take everything that Nick just talked about and use all the constraints that he provides, this much HCN, this temperature, so on and so forth, then really put that into a beaker in the lab, essentially, pipette in hydrogen cyanide. So for one example, one reaction, put in some hydrogen cyanide, put in a metal, either copper or iron, maybe a source of sulfur in there too, then you shine UV light on it, you can actually make sugars and make the building blocks of life all the way through to ribonucleotide monomers, the letters of RNA. So I'm interested in understanding how that prebiotic chemistry functions in the planetary environment. So for example, like, can we elucidate any sorts of constraints on the pH and the temperature that might be necessary for this chemistry to function? Can we understand at what point the destructive effects of UV light become a roadblock or become make the chemistry essentially impossible to occur? So basically things like that. My goal is to be able to understand what sort of planetary environments are best for making this chemistry actually function.
Amazing. Wow. Zach, you also work in a lab, and in that lab, I know you mix lipids with amino acids. These are two of the other building blocks of life to try to mimic what might have occurred on the early Earth. So could you share with us what kinds of cool chemistry emerges in your experiments?
Yeah, lots of cool things happen. So some research that I've helped work on with lots of other cool people at UW shows that the building blocks of proteins, amino acids, can actually bind to these primitive membranes that I study. And so this helps to explain how all of the components of a developing cell could have actually gotten together in the same physical location, but just by binding. And this binding of building blocks to membranes also helps the membrane resist collapsing in salty solution. And on the other hand, the membrane helps the building blocks link together into a protein chain. And so there's potential there for a positive feedback helping develop a cell, is the idea.
So like a symbiosis sort of between these two components working together. Yeah, positive feedbacks are definitely a big part of life. And now, Rika, you use a very fancy tool that you call bioinformatics to understand how life evolved billions of years ago. First, can you tell us what bioinformatics is and how does it reveal what life was like in the distant past?
So bioinformatics is basically the study of information in biology. And most of the information, well, one of the ways information is stored in biology is in DNA. And so, like I said earlier, one thing I do is I look at the genomes of modern organisms, and you do some sleuthing to try to put together their past based on their current genomes, which hold almost like, you could think of it like memories of their past encoded in their genomes. And so we're looking at those memories. And so one of the things we do is we look at the microbes and the viruses that live in hydrothermal vents today, which, as I said, may have been one of the settings for the origin of life. And we try to understand, how are they evolving now? What are the things that are pushing those microbes and those viruses to evolve in a certain direction? One thing I've been really interested in is understanding these viruses because they're parasites. And parasites are a part of an evolutionary system. And in the origin of life, we think that during this potential RNA world, when these molecules are busy replicating and cooperating with each other, you could have had some cheaters coming in there and taking over the system, basically early parasites. So I'm interested in the evolution of how microbes cooperate and how microbes deal with parasites, with the hope that maybe we can take some of what we've learned and apply that to models for how life may have evolved in its earliest stages. More broadly, what's interesting about this group is that when you think about how to study the origin of life, there's basically two approaches to get to it. And actually, Mike, I know you've written about this in a very nice way. You can have bottom-up approaches like Nick and Zach and Zoe have been talking about, where you're doing a lot of experimental and modeling work to try to figure out what were the conditions and what could have been the right chemical reactions to create life from the bottom up. And I'm more from the top down. So I look at extant biology and try to deduce, based on what we can see now, try to piece together what it looked like way back then. Problem is, it's kind of hard for those two to meet in the middle. And so I can only really get so far with the work that I'm doing. You can get maybe as far as the last universal common ancestor to all life on Earth, which we call LUCA. And there's been some bioinformatics work that has suggested that maybe LUCA lived in a deep sea hydrothermal vent, but as with everything in the origin of life, that was also very controversial. So that's the kind of work that I work on with my students.
That's super cool. And yeah, you bring up a great point. Well, first of all, thanks for being the one top-down approach person on our panel, Rika. Way to represent. Yeah, you talk about this huge gap between this bottom-up approach, trying to synthesize the very first living organism from prebiotic materials in a very chaotic environment, and trying to understand life's earliest nature through the clues that it's left behind for us in the information that it's propagated through time. I was just wondering if anybody has any ideas for how to bridge that massive gap in understanding.
If we could do that, Mike, I think we'd be paid a lot more money.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm sure you've all encountered a lot of wild theories in your time studying the origin of life. And, this field is definitely no stranger to really crazy ideas. And some of them may even be crazy enough to be true. So I was wondering if you could share one idea or concept that you've encountered that seems to be like super out there, but might actually have a nugget of truth to it, or that simply intrigues you.
So there's some research that I'll mention that I think is kind of exciting about the origin of life within deep cracks in the Earth's crust. And so specifically, these are deep cracks, deep enough so that carbon dioxide there is actually pressurized to form a supercritical phase, which is something weird between like a gas and a liquid. It's not what we usually think about when we think about biology, but it's just been noticed that there's really cool chemistry that emerges that potentially could give you a lot of the features we think were important in origin of life.
I don't think that idea is even so crazy. I think it's a super cool idea because, as a deep sea biologist, we can drill super deep in the Earth's crust and we have seen life, miles below the ocean floor. What's also kind of interesting is it's been suggested to me that within those cracks that you just mentioned, we could potentially get those wet-dry cycles that you had talked about as being found in those warm little ponds at the surface. So, who knows? Maybe that is an interesting spot to look.
Yeah. Wow. Never thought about that before. So one big debate or theme, I guess, in the origin and early evolution of life is the relative roles of chance versus necessity. Were we just a happy accident that we happened to originate here on Earth, that life happened to originate here on Earth, or was life on Earth an inevitable outcome of planetary evolution? I was wondering where you each fall on this.
I feel a different way every time I wake up in the morning. So I go back and forth all the time. But this morning, I think it's pretty uncommon. But yeah, there's arguments both ways, and it's so uncertain. But that's my general feeling right now. Mostly to do with sort of, right, there's so many ideas for how life began, but there's some ideas that some people, or maybe I think, are more likely, and those sort of seem kind of lucky to me. Yeah, I wonder what other people think.
I personally am in the inevitable camp, given the conditions on early Earth, but I will acknowledge that maybe it may have been inevitable and have relied on some very improbable events. And an example that is coming up in my mind is these experiments where people start with random protein sequences and keep mutating them until something functional like an enzyme emerges. And this usually requires many, many rounds of mutation, and most of the mutants that you would generate are going to be totally useless. But eventually this kind of process can give you something that works, like a functional enzyme. So, maybe given enough time, an incredibly improbable process would become inevitable.
So I think that's a really interesting point, Zach, that I hadn't actually thought about before. Because before you said that, I was gonna fall with Nick and be like, oh, I think we're pretty lucky that we got here. But maybe just to incorporate what Zach said, I think there's also a distinction between simple life versus complex life and how I fall and how common or uncommon those are. So simple life, like bacteria, I can believe that that's pretty common and that it might not take too much to get to that point from the evolution of the planet. But then you might be able to ask the question, well, why don't we see simple life on Venus or Mars today? Or why haven't we seen that definitively yet? Maybe it is there, maybe it's not. But then the thing that becomes more improbable for me is the developing of complex life. So things like multicellular plants, humans, animals, things like that. This emergence of intelligent life, I think, requires a lot more happy accidents to occur, but who knows?
Yeah, if we're asking the question of how inevitable it was that life began here, I mean, one thing that's often cited is the fact that there is life pretty much as soon as we look, as far back as we can go, there is life in the fossil record, in the geochemical record, even though the Earth was being pummeled by asteroids quite a bit fairly early on. It almost feels like as soon as it was possible, life emerged. Is that lucky? I have no idea. But one thing, I was talking to some colleagues just yesterday, actually, and I was learning from some astronomers that whereas I had previously thought that our Earth is a fairly typical planet in a fairly typical solar system in a fairly typical galaxy, it turns out I may be wrong about that our planet actually may be fairly rare, that solar systems that look like ours may not be that common, that if you look out there, a lot of solar systems and exoplanets that we're seeing have these crazy dynamical situations where you're getting really close and then really far away from your star, and where you have binary star systems, and that may not have the right ingredients for an origin of life. And so that really set me back. And I thought, oh, maybe we're not so boring after all. Maybe we're actually pretty rare. I don't think we have a good handle on that yet, but it was something I hadn't really considered before, that maybe this planet, the solar system, really had the right conditions for an origin of life, and maybe we got lucky.
Well, that's a great segue to my next question, which is to turn our brains to the great beyond and ask you, if life exists out there, what features might be different about it, and what features would we expect to stay the same? For example, might alien biochemistry use completely different molecules, or are ours uniquely suited for the job? I guess I'm trying to get at this contingent versus conserved quantities of life idea, kind of bringing us full circle to our discussion of definitions at the beginning. What do you all think?
I certainly think it's possible that alien life could use different molecules. And we already know that it's possible for life to incorporate different DNA bases, for example. And many people, I think many researchers suspect that primitive life on Earth actually didn't use RNA or DNA, but instead something similar that kind of behaved similarly, but was easier to form on the early Earth. So I totally think that's possible.
Sorry, you go ahead, Nick.
Oh, okay. But yeah, so I definitely totally agree with that. But when it comes to like using completely different like molecules, like for example, people talk about silicon-based life or something like that in Star Trek, which is great, very interesting. But there's just a interesting coincidence that like the most common elements in the universe, right, are molecules or atoms like hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and what are we made of? Oh, and carbon, of course, where carbon is extremely common. I think it's fourth most common in the universe. Is it a coincidence that we are made of those same things, right? So I don't think so. If it was really easier to make life with silicon, which is much less common than those molecules, then it seems like that maybe would have happened here. So yeah, that's my general thought about completely different biochemistries.
So I like both of those points that Nick and Zach brought up. I'm going to bring up another one, which is even if you stick to a carbon-based chemistry, you could imagine completely different molecules, like a completely different solvent system. So there could be types of weird life that are not necessarily silicon-based or based on entirely different elements out there. And so I think as astrobiologists, as people looking for life out there, the more ways that we can look for life or that life might be out there, the better. So I think not restricting ourselves to only searching for RNA on other planets or DNA is the way to go, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, one thing you got me, I was thinking about before you spoke, Zoe, was the likelihood that water is going to be an important solvent, because one of NASA's founding principles is follow the water. And some of our colleagues in the astrobiology community have suggested, well, maybe we shouldn't be so focused on water. Maybe we should be looking at other solvents. Maybe we should be following the energy, for example, is one idea I've heard. As an oceanographer, I do tend to like water quite a bit. And one interesting place that some folks have looked is Titan, which is a moon of Saturn, I believe. Yes, Saturn. And Titan is interesting because it has lakes of methane and oceans of ethane. And so it could be one of these places where you could have a completely different solvent. And I know some prebiotic chemists really like Titan because it's just covered in organic molecules. It's like ripe for prebiotic chemistry. But it's also super cold in order to get those lakes. And so I would imagine that things would move very, very slowly. And so there's going to be a drone type thing, a quadcopter being sent to Titan called Dragonfly fairly soon. So we'll learn more as soon as that mission lands. But the water-based oceanography me for now is a little bit skeptical, but we shall see. I like your reminder to us, Zoe, that we should be open-minded. I think that's important.
By soon for Dragonfly, it's like 2042, right? Or something like that.
Yeah. Not
Relatively.
Really soon at all.
Over the age of the universe, it's pretty soon.
Right.
All right. Well, I think it is time now to turn to audience questions. We've had quite a few being submitted. But before we do that, everyone out there watching this panel, you have now the chance to contribute your thoughts via poetry. So we invite you to submit haikus on the origin of life based on the material that you learned and heard about today from our 4 panelists. As a reminder, a haiku is a poem where the first line has 5 syllables, the second line 7 syllables, and the third line 5 syllables again. Just 3 lines, 5, 7, 5, and you don't have to worry about rhyming. You can go to tinyurl.com/AB-haiku to submit your haikus right now. And at the very end, we will read the 3 winners for best astrobiology origin of life haiku submitted tonight. So in that form, you will see an optional field where you can put identifying info if you'd like us to read your name out loud should it win as well. So please go to tinyurl.com/AB-haiku for the chance to have the glory of your haiku read aloud at the end of the discussion tonight. And with that, we will move on to our audience questions. So there's been a lot of discussion in the chat about viruses. Perhaps, that's in the collective psyche of all of us right now. We're thinking about viruses and whether or not viruses qualify as life. So maybe by a show of hands, raise your hand, panelists, if you think that a virus is alive or that viruses qualify as life. So I see a yes from Zach. I see shrugs from the other 3. So Zach, since you were the only definitive one, maybe tell us why viruses are alive.
Yeah, maybe I came on a little too strongly, but no, I would say so. Like I said in the beginning, I feel like Darwinian evolution is a very important feature of life. Populations of viruses can certainly evolve, as we know about with mutant strains. Yeah, so they have different requirements than cells. Certainly, they need where cells can take in simple molecules like glucose. Cells need intact biological molecules and cellular machinery. So they're different, but I would still put them in that category of life.
Mm-hmm. So Zach, you make as somebody who studies viruses, I get asked this question constantly. You make a good point, Zach, that they do evolve. And if that is the basis for your definition of life, then yeah, they would qualify. As somebody who's ambivalent about whether we need a definition of life or not, my response is usually a virus is going to virus regardless of what we call it or not. And that's all that matters to me.
That's a great quote. I love that. Virus is gonna virus. Okay. Any other thoughts on viruses before we move on? All right, we'll just let them virus then. So Zijun He asks, what kinds of reactions occur at hydrothermal vents? I guess, Rika, you'd probably be best suited for this one.
Yeah, I'll just give one example. So there is a type of hydrothermal vent that's particularly interesting. It's the sort of poster child for this is a hydrothermal vent field called Lost City in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And those hydrothermal vents are unusual, although that kind of hydrothermal vent was probably fairly common on the early Earth, which is why I bring it up. They're unusual because they were powered by a water-rock reaction called serpentinization. It's just called that because the rock that comes out of it looks like a snake skin, so it's called serpentinization. The reason we're interested in serpentinization is that when you combine water with rocks called olivine, so they look like this green mineral. When you combine rock and water together, a certain type of rock, you get serpentinite, so that's the snake-looking rock. But you also get things like methane and hydrogen and acetate and formate and heat. And you also get water with a really high pH. So it's almost like toilet bowl cleaner. And so that particular reaction is thought to be very interesting for early Earth studies because it does tend to create a lot of, first of all, organic molecules, but it also creates a lot of hydrogen, which is a really important basis for microbial metabolism today. And so that is, I'll just use that as like one of the key examples that we think is a really important reaction in deep sea hydrothermal vents today. And back then.
Sounds like a buffet for microbes. Jalen Shawcross wants to know, what do you think about the possibility of life arriving at Earth by comets? Or I guess you can extend that to asteroids as well. What do we think about this idea that life didn't actually originate on Earth and it came from somewhere else?
So I think that's a fascinating idea. This is something called Panspermia, which is the idea that life originated somewhere else and is seeded throughout the solar system or throughout the universe. So I think it's entirely possible that comets were quite important for delivering either organic molecules, but you could take that one step further. And by organic molecules, I mean like things like either the hydrogen cyanide that Nick mentioned earlier, or something more complex like nucleobases. I think it was mentioned that by Zach that these could be synthesized by comets. But if you take it one step further, can you actually have a full-fledged life form if we have a definition of life that is delivered by comets? No, maybe, maybe not, but comets are definitely interesting from an origin of life perspective regardless, in my opinion.
If that's true, it'll still leave the question of how did that life form wherever it formed? So be unsatisfying, I guess.
But it is a good question. I mean, like, we have asteroids on Earth that we know came from Mars. Like, there are rocks from Mars on Earth. So it's possible to transport material between planets. And it's, I don't know, it's definitely an interesting question, I think.
Yeah, great question, Jalen. That was an awesome discussion. We have a question from Raymond Buckley, who says, it seems that often life developing on Earth is thought of as happening in a single location from a single process, but how about multiple locations and multiple different processes over time? I think Rika was hinting at this when we were discussing hydrothermal vents versus warm little ponds. Maybe it was some combination of the two working together. So I was wondering if anybody has further thoughts on that. And then I'll put my own spin on the question, which is, if this is indeed the case, that it was the whole Earth working together to create the origin of life, how will we ever test that in the lab?
Oh, well, since I brought it up, I can take a stab at this. There's kind of two parts to that question, right? So the origin of life itself probably had multiple steps, right? And my fellow panelists have alluded to some of these steps. We needed to make the first organic molecules. We needed to turn those organic molecules into longer chains of molecules called polymers to turn them into something useful. We needed to get things to start replicating. We needed to somehow encapsulate them in a lipid membrane. Each of those different steps, I could easily imagine having occurred in different settings because they each have different settings, have different conditions we might need to cause those steps to happen. And then maybe, the actual last universal common ancestor to life on Earth further down the road may have been in one general habitat. But the other piece to that question, which I think is a more interesting one, is could there have been multiple origins of life happening all around the planet? And how do we figure that out? And this is kind of where we get to this top-down, bottom-up problem where we can't quite meet them in the middle, because if there were multiple origins of life on the planet, I don't know that we'd necessarily be able to see that. At least, what we are looking at now, using the methods I used from the top-down approach, we're looking at the survivors. I can't tell who went extinct necessarily. I can't tell you if there were multiple last universal common ancestors and only one of them won out. Now, how we do that in the lab, I'm going to let my fellow panelists address that, because that's less my forte.
Any other thoughts?
Well, yeah, so I guess like doing this in the lab would be very challenging, but I agree entirely that it seems very possible to me that there were multiple origins of life or multiple scenarios all occurring across the planet at the same time that could have led to an origin of life. But it does seem clear that, as Rika said, we're looking at the survivors. Since pretty much all life on Earth that we see uses the same RNA, DNA, genetic code, it seems like that all came from one common, last universal common ancestor. And the question is, were there other streams that originated and died out, and maybe the life that we came from was the most dominant, so it pretty much wiped out all the other life. So I don't know how you test that in the lab necessarily. You can mix things up and see, once you make something that you would call life in the lab, which might be fairly soon, people are pretty good at doing that. Then if you can put different spins on that and see if you can actually get these populations evolving and dying out at the same time, would be interesting.
Yeah, very cool. So we have a question from Jeffrey Needle, who asks if life began during the late heavy bombardment. So think of the image behind Nick's head. Does this favor an origin of life in hydrothermal vents? And so maybe I'll just toss this one to Nick and maybe say why or how the impacts can influence the origin of life on a planet.
Yeah. So one challenge with the early Earth is that when we look at really old rocks, they generally suggest that volcanoes would have produced gases like nitrogen and CO2. And so we think that, maybe the atmosphere was made of those gases. But the problem with that is that organic chemists don't like those gases for making life. They want, instead of so CO2 is right, to have oxygen attached to carbon, but instead of CO2, they want CH4, methane. So those are called reduced or reducing molecules because they have hydrogens attached to the carbon instead of oxygens. And so impacts potentially could have delivered that source of, could have perturbed the atmosphere and actually made a bunch of methane, which would have been a much more favorable environment to make the organic molecules that the organic chemists say that they can make interesting things with. So the impacts have iron cores, and the iron cores would have liked to react with, you can imagine a big impact happening, and it makes a big steamy atmosphere. It's very, very hot. And you can imagine the iron from the impactor reacting with the steam, and the iron would steal the oxygens from the steam, from the water. So H2O would then become hydrogen. Long story short is, you end up with a bunch of hydrogen and you make a bunch of molecules that contain hydrogen, like methane. And then you get the favorable organic molecules. So impacts are certainly seem like a good thing for the origin of life. Yeah.
Can I just jump in?
Oh, go ahead.
I asked the same question myself. It's a great question. I asked the same question myself just a couple of days ago to a bunch of astronomer colleagues of mine. And the response kind of blew my mind a little, because when I was a student at UW in the astrobiology program, I was taught that the late heavy bombardment was a thing and that it really molded the origin of life and is a really important thing we need to think about when considering the origin of life. And the astronomers told me that apparently the late heavy bombardment is no longer thought to be the absolute certain thing that happened for 0.3 billion years ago. And instead, they're starting to think that maybe all those meteors or asteroids didn't necessarily hit quite in that same condensed time period. Maybe there weren't quite as many as we had previously thought, and maybe they were more spread out than we had previously appreciated. And there's also sort of a certain amount of uncertainty around whether the oceans would have vaporized or not as a result of these impacts. And so what's interesting to me and what I love about this is how those of us who are biologists and chemists and geologists are talking to astronomers too, because we really need to have those inputs too to understand the context for an origin of life on Earth or elsewhere.
So I guess just a little bit of background there is like when people say the late heavy bombardment, they typically mean that at 3.9 billion years ago, there was a very cataclysmic event where like a bunch of asteroids hit Earth. And that maybe didn't happen. Actually, it does seem to, I think generally speaking, people think that did not happen. And, but there still would have been many impacts. And when you just look at the moon, it's full of craters. Yeah.
All right, we are running out of time, so I want to remind our listeners that this is your last chance to submit your award-winning haiku right now to tinyurl.com/ab-haiku. I'm going to stop sharing this URL with you now while we take maybe one more question. So this one is from Parul Aurora. Viruses like bacteriophages help in transferring DNA from one species of bacteria to the other. Do you think they could have had a role in evolution? And maybe I'll just toss this to Rika to talk about horizontal gene transfer in general and how that sort of maybe messes up the tree of life.
Yeah, so just some background. The horizontal gene transfer is this process whereby genes from one type of microbe could then get inserted into the genome of another microbe. And the key here is that these microbes, they have the same genes now, not because they came from the same parent, but or from the same microbe that split, but instead because those genes were shared laterally. And this can happen through either viruses swapping genes between their victims. It can happen just when microbes take up DNA in the environment. It can also happen when microbes actually form a pilus between them and swap DNA in that way. And it's true, viruses are a very common vector of this. This is something I study in my lab a lot, and it absolutely messes up our understanding of the tree of life. But it's also kind of cool because it's a way for evolutionary innovation to happen very quickly. And so one thing I've often thought about is whether, because viruses nowadays can be these important vectors of new ideas, right? New evolutionary innovations between these microbes, could something similar have been happening at the earliest stages of the evolution of life? In other words, could there have been some way, viral or not, that these early replicating networks or these early protocells could have been swapping information back and forth as a way of, leapfrogging their way through evolution? It's pretty certain that was happening quite a bit at the earliest stages of the evolution of life. And this was a way for, you can think of it as replicating networks sharing ideas, right? And perhaps joining together as they evolved to become more complex over time.
I love that. Wonderful. Sharing ideas. Yeah, trading pieces of DNA. So panelists, one last question for you all. Where can our listeners find you on the internet to follow your ideas and your work? Maybe we'll go with Zach first.
I have a Twitter, ZachCohen55, not very active, but you can also send me an email. My email is just ZachCohen55@gmail.com. Yeah.
All right. Zoe, why don't you go next?
I also am not very active on social media. So yeah, email is probably the best way to reach me. Google me, find my email, or it's ztodd@uw.edu. I'd be happy to answer questions or anything like that.
Awesome. Nick?
Also, don't do too much social media. So yeah, email would be the way to talk to me. And my email is my last name @uw.edu. So Wogan@uw.edu. Or it's probably somewhere if you Google it.
And last but not least, Rika.
I am on Twitter, although not as active as some, but I am on Twitter. Rika E. Anderson is my handle. You can also find out what my students are up to. I have a lab website. So if you just Google my name and Carleton College, you probably find my lab website. You can see all the cool projects my students are working on.
Excellent. And you can follow UW Astrobiology on Instagram at UW @miq.astrobiology. And you can follow me on Twitter. I'm MikeY at MIQUAI. And I want to throw out a special thanks to my fellow UW astrobiologists Lucas Pfeiffer, Trent Thomas, and Evan Davis for all of their incredible behind the scenes work tonight. It definitely was a team effort, and we thank them very, very much. And now, could I get a drum roll for the haiku winners? I'm just going to pretend you're drum rolling over there on the other side of this Zoom call or YouTube, YouTube Live. Here we go. I said there would be 3. There are actually 4 haiku winners, and I'll need to minimize my face so that I can actually read them. There we go. Okay, so Tatum Butler. So, what defines life? 2 blinking eyes? Moving limbs? No, nothing at all. Well done, Tatum. From Penelope Boston, sprinkling of stardust, planet cauldron, add water, voila, here comes life. Excellent, Penelope. And Lana Crumrine, happy accident, inevitable results. Either way, we're here. Indeed. And finally, from an anonymous submitter, life begets itself, yet wonders why it is here, hopes it has cousins. And with that, let's now turn to how we're going to find those cousins if they are out there. If you're interested in how we will find and recognize life out there, please tune in to the 3rd UW Astrobiology panel on July 28th, 2021 at 6 p.m. Pacific time. We have 4 more excellent UW astrobiologists. And again, I will be your moderator for that panel. Please, if you're sitting at home watching this, give a big round of applause to all of today's panelists for sharing their insights about the origin and nature of life in our universe. And with that, we'll see you in July. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.